The most recent winners of the Nobel Peace Prize have called for the abolition of nuclear weapons, warning the taboo around their use might disappear. Syria's interim leader announced he was taking charge of the country as caretaker prime minister until March the 1st. Protests in Georgia are continuing despite arrests and physical attacks against activists and opposition figures. A 92-year-old Japanese man who lived through the American atomic bombing of Nagasaki called for an abolition of all nuclear weapons as he accepted this year's Nobel Peace Prize. The prize was awarded to Nihon Hidinaku, a grassroots movement of Japanese atomic bombing survivors who work to maintain a taboo around the use of nuclear weapons.
兵器国とそれらの同盟国の市民の中にしっかりと核兵器は人類と共存できない、共存させてはならないという信念が根付くこと、自国の政府の核政策を変えさせる力になること、それを私たちは願っております。ガザ地区に対して
The group expressed fear that the taboo around the use of nuclear weapons was weakening, expressing sadness and anger at Israeli and Russian threats of the possibility at using nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons have grown exponentially in powers and numbers since being used by the US on Japan in the Second World War. Syria's new interim leader Mohammed al-Bashir announced he was taking charge of the country as caretaker prime minister until March the 1st, with the beginning of the former rebels who toppled President Bashar al-Assad only days ago. The departing government met with al-Bashir for the first time on Tuesday since Assad fled Damascus over the weekend. Al-Bashir told reporters after the meeting that the ministers discussed transferring the portfolios to the interim government during the transitional period until the beginning of March. Elsewhere in Syria, people continue to celebrate for a third day and shops and banks reopened, despite Israeli airstrikes across the country. The Biden administration said it will recognize and support a new Syrian government that renounces terrorism, destroys chemical weapon stocks, and protects the rights of minorities and women.
The Austrian government says it has started preparations for a deportation program for Syrians living in the country. The decision followed the government's suspension of asylum applications from Syrian refugees and comes as millions of refugees are now able to return home. The Interior Ministry said a reassessment of about 40,000 Syrians granted status over the last 5 years has begun.
Ja, das, was jetzt vorbereitet wird, das nämlich geordnet ist, dass es hier eine Prioritätenreihung gibt, dass jene vor allem im Mittelpunkt stehen, die kriminell geworden sind, jene, die sich nicht anpassen wollen den kulturellen Werten in Europa, in Österreich, beziehungsweise jene, die nicht arbeiten wollen und daher nur von Sozialleistungen leben. Auf die wird klar die Priorität gesetzt bei diesem.
On Monday, thousands of Syrians took to the streets of Vienna to celebrate the fall of Bashar al-Assad. Many in the Austrian capital waved the Syrian flags. Around 95,000 Syrians live in Austria, many of whom arrived during the migrant crisis of 2015 and 2016. The start of the civil war in 2011 forced some 14 million Syrians to leave the country.
Israel denied that its military troops are advancing towards Damascus by going beyond the demilitarized buffer zone, which separates Israeli-occupied Golan Heights and Syrian territory. The capital city, as well as the coastal city of Latakia, have been the target of Israeli airstrikes since the fall of al-Assad's regime. Israel claimed the wave of airstrikes is an attempt to destroy key military infrastructure. On Tuesday, Israel's defense minister Israel Katz confirmed that the military successfully destroyed Syria's military fleet.
אני מזהיר מכאן את מנהיגי המורדים בסוריה. מי שילך בדרכו של אסד יסיים כמו אסד. לא נאפשר לישות טרור אסלאמית קיצונית לפעול נגד ישראל מעבר לגבולה ותוך סיכון אזרחיה. נעשה כל מה שנדרש כדי להסיר את האיום.
Gotz also said they intend to establish a demilitarized zone in southern Syria in order to prevent attacks on Israel. Meanwhile, at a press conference, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded to the growing criticism over Israel's takeover of the demilitarized buffer zone and said Golan Heights will remain part of Israel for eternity. The European Union's foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas urged that the transition of power in Syria after the fall of Bashar al-Assad should not descend into retaliation between opposing factions.
The transition will present huge challenges in Syria and in the region. First, there are legitimate concerns about the risks of sectarian violence, extremist resurgence, and a governance vacuum, all of which must be averted. We must avoid a repeat of the horrific scenarios of Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan.
Kallas called for the protection of all Syrians, including minority groups, as well as the freedom of religion. The top diplomat said the first signals coming from the rebel forces were good, but that it is too early to issue a verdict. She said the coming weeks are therefore crucial to see if Syria's political situation continues in the right direction. At least 3 people were killed and 20 injured, many of who are in critical condition after a Russian strike hit a private clinic in the city of Zaporizhzhia. Among the victims were 2 doctors and a 5-year-old girl. The strike also damaged buildings nearby. In a post on social media platform X, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the strikes prove that Ukraine needs to enhance its air defense systems. He added that Kyiv submitted all the necessary requests to its partners to do so. The attack came after the Ukrainian president said he's open to the potential deployment of Western troops in Ukraine. Zelensky has said that this would bring Ukraine a step closer to joining NATO. Meanwhile, at least 11 were injured as a result of a double ballistic missile attack on the town of Slaropil in the Kharkiv region. An administrative and 16 residential buildings were damaged, that is according to local authorities.
Days after Romania's presidential election result was declared invalid due to alleged foreign interference, the European Commission has avoided commentating on the decision. However, it is still investigating the social network TikTok and its role in the electoral process, in which independent candidate Calin Georgescu won the first round.
We're now consolidating and assessing all these pieces of evidence that we have received, and based on that, we'll decide on next steps with regard to TikTok.
The feeling among several MEPs is that the Chinese social media network has turned a blind eye to the possible use of its algorithm by a state actor, suspected to be Russia.
They have permitted electoral publicity which was not marked properly. They have permitted electoral publicity on election day which was illegally. And they have permitted the campaign of a candidate being funded with many millions of euros, although that candidate has publicly indicated a budget of €0 for his whole campaign.
But some MEPs think the Constitutional Court's decision to annul the elections went too far.
On parle d'une dictature, le début d'une nouvelle dictature. On parle bien d'avoir tué la démocratie de cette manière. On parle bien de la réinstauration d'une forme de totalitarisme.
Others applaud the court as they believe that citizens will now be able to count on a fair trial.
I don't think a manipulated election means that the rights of the citizens are respected.
Brussels has not said whether it will take action on the possible violation of the Digital Services Act by TikTok.
Protests in Georgia against the suspension of EU accession talks have continued despite arrests and attacks against activists and opposition figures. Demonstrators gathered outside the Georgian Parliament building in Tbilisi on Tuesday, chanting and blocking the streets. Local reports say more than 300 protesters have been detained so far.
Large-scale pro-European protests have been ongoing in Georgia for the 13th consecutive day. Demonstrators in the capital city of Georgia, Tbilisi, and other cities of the country are protesting Georgian Dream's decision to delay the negotiations with the European Union until 2028. These protests are driven by citizens rather than being led by the opposition parties. On Monday, three main demands of the protesters were outlined, printed on flyers, and delivered, among them the new parliamentary elections, the release of individuals detained during the protests, and the imposition of sanctions on those responsible. These are the main demands of the protests. Hundreds of people have been arrested over the past 12 days in Georgia, both during and after demonstrations. According to the information of the Georgian public defender, many of them were tortured.
Fishermen in Spain continued their strike protesting proposed European cuts that would largely restrict the number of days they can fish in the Mediterranean. The European Union wants to decrease the number of fishing days for Mediterranean trawlers by 79% in an effort to improve fish stocks and protect biodiversity. Protesters argue that these cuts would badly harm Spain's economy and damage the fishing industry. They also believe the EU's plan is based on flawed data and does not take local fishermen's concerns into account. Representatives within the fishing industry agreed that the proposal could lead to the disappearance of trawling. The field reportedly employs around 3,000 people on board and generates a further 17,000 jobs indirectly. EU fishery ministers are continuing to discuss the proposal in Brussels.